any party wish to take your flag, please just get over there to have your flag in order to have a better arrangement for raise questions. And for those observers, I'm not sure we have flag for observers, but you just raise your hand. And for those ones who are participating online, please raise your virtual hands. So dear delegates, colleagues, and friends, welcome to the second and last part, I'm so sorry to say that, of the second meeting of the OECD under the second periodical review. Yesterday, we heard from the IPCC, the UNEP, the Standing Committee on Finance, on the global trend scenarios for and our collective progress towards achieve the long-term global goal. We also discussed the global financial flows towards achieving the long-term global goal. The exchange we had was rich and extensive, touched on many aspects of the important topics under the two themes of the second periodical review. I would like to reiterate my appreciation, and also on behalf of Tara, to all the presenters and post-contributors for their dedicated and engagement in our dialogue. And today we will focus on regional perspectives on the two periodical review themes, complementing what was discussed yesterday on the global aspects. As I mentioned yesterday, we are very pleased that we have a set of 8 posters to complement our discussion here in the plenary. They are contributed by the WMO Regional Climate Centers for Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Southwest Pacific on regional trends in observed climate and weather patterns, and associated socio-economic impacts, and the UN Economic and Social Commissions for Western Asia, or UNESCO WA, on efforts to improve decision-making through enhanced climate modeling and analysis, as well as regional efforts to mobilize finance in the region. I hope many of you had the chance to join the poster session today to join the discussion here. For today's dialogue, we would like to break into 2 segments. The first will focus on theme 1 and the second focus on theme 2. For the theme 1, to kickstart the first segment, we have a set of short interventions from WMO Regional Climate Centers for Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Southwest Pacific. As we heard yesterday in the context of the Working Group 1 contribution to the 6th assessment report, the provisions of climate information is essential for early warning and early action to avoid loss and damage caused by extreme weather and climate events, and therefore represents an important adaptation response. Therefore, we have invited WMO Regional Climate Center representatives to brief our meeting on the latest information and insights based on the observed data for their represented regions. This will be complemented by inputs on projections into the future at regional level to be provided by the IPCC during the second segment. So as we move from global to regional to be more granular insight, it does mean that we have a larger number of short interventions, but I count on the speakers to stay within their allocated 3 minutes in order to leave ample time for open dialogue. Now, without further ado, I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Atsushi Goto, representing WMO Regional Center for Asia, to give us the brief presentation. Mr. Goto, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. So my name is Atsushi Goto from the Tokyo Climate Center. It's WMO Regional Climate Center, Tokyo. So let's begin my presentation. At first, the Asia mean temperature for 2020 was 1.3 degrees Celsius above the 1981 to 2010 average, which places the year 2020 as the warmest year on record. Many parts of Asia and surrounding ocean experienced the heat event in the 2020. Particularly, temperatures reached 31.0 degrees Celsius at Verkhoyansk on 20 June. This is provisionally the highest known temperature anywhere north of the Arctic Circle. Glaciers in high mountain Asia region experienced mass loss with an accelerating trend. In addition to that, the minimum sea ice extent in the Arctic Sea in 2020 was the second lowest since 1979. Asia is a region subject to the monsoon rainfall and tropical cyclones. In 2020, floods and storms affected approximately 50 million people, including over 5,000 lives lost in the region. However, this is below the annual average of the last 2 decades. The COVID-19 pandemic complicated disaster management efforts, and countries faced the dual challenge of tackling the pandemic and climate-related hazards. For example, Cyclone Amphan, one of the strongest cyclones ever recorded, hit densely populated coastal areas in Bangladesh and India during the rapid spread of the COVID-19 in May 2020. The response to the impact of Amphan was made difficult owing to the restriction imposed during the pandemic and disruption of supply chains. So adaptation measures such as the implementation of early warning systems are key component of reducing exposure and vulnerability to hydro and weather hazards. According to the WMO's 2020 State of Climate Services record, Asia is currently well placed to respond to early extreme weather events. However, there is a substantial need for improved data from all countries in the region to obtain a clearer picture of gaps and needs moving forward for Asia as a whole. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goto. Now may I invite Mr. Stephen Rosner, representing the WMO Regional Center for Europe, to give his brief presentation. Stephen, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to inform about the findings in WMO Region 6, Europe. As you can see, it's stretching from Greenland in the northwest to Jordan in the southeast, and from the Azores Island in the west far into Russia. R6 has big areas with little to no population, and therefore also little to no observations, especially in the northern parts, and also due to harsh conditions. But on the other side, there are also highly populated areas with high value infrastructure that are exposed to natural hazards, especially related to precipitation, wind, and temperature. But it also has many institutions with high competencies, including, for example, Copernicus. However, the 51 members of WMO RA6 also follow very diverse data policies for exchanging the observations, which does not facilitate producing the information. And yes, RA6 too observes an increasing temperature, here shown for European sub-area of RA6, and you can clearly see the increase. This figure shows you heat waves the severity and duration. And you clearly can see that the 23 heat waves, the most severe heat waves that have been experienced in this area, most of them happened in the past 21 years, and the 2010 heat wave in Russia clearly, in 2010, clearly being the most extreme. RE6 also experiences sea level rise, which is especially critical to the highly populated and low-lying areas. This map on the left shows that sea level rise is not uniform as everywhere. However, the overall direction is upwards at about 2.5 millimeter per year for the northwest shelf. That's the area in the northern part of Europe. With regard to impact information, our RCC produces on a monthly and seasonal basis event maps based on its gridded monitoring products via an objective procedure, so you can immediately see where special conditions have been observed. On the other hand, based on reports received from WMO members in the region and from media, we also produce an extreme event map highlighting selected extreme events on a subjective basis, which are all collected also into a database system for future evaluation. However, cataloging of hazardous events in a systematic way across the region is not yet being done, but WMO is working on an implementation plan to get this started. As adaptation starts with daily warnings, early warning systems at national levels are essential. In Europe, Meteo Alarm, shown here, combines the individual national early warning systems and provides a regional overview. The role of the RCC is to provide on a longer time scale of weeks up to a season climate watches to allow for early preparatory measures well ahead of possibly upcoming extreme events. However, there's still a need to further develop forecasting systems at sub-seasonal to seasonal size scales to improve quality of forecasts, especially for precipitation, and to support climate watch activities. Thank you, that ends my talk.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now, may I invite Mr. Blair Turin, representing WMO Regional Climate Center for Southwest Pacific, to give his brief presentation. And I would like to say special thank you. Okay, so we will continue with the African region. So very sadly that Mr. Blair Turin and also Jose Malango is not locked down. We will continue to try our best to get them in touch. So may I now invite the representatives from the WMO Regional Climate Center of Africa, Mr. Andrew I'm so sorry if I pronounced it in a very bad way. Mr. Andrew Kamga for Moho to give us your brief presentation. Sir, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. We'll go through some climate change and impacts across Africa. Next slide, please. We'll go through temperature trends, change on precipitation variability, because in our case, we are seeing more of a multi-decadal variability rather than a trend, a clear trend on precipitation. Then trends on extremes and impacts. Next slide. Yeah, so this is for temperature. The main message here is that Africa is warming quicker than the global average, and the highest warming rate, around 4 degrees per century, is seen over North Africa, North African countries. So for temperature, North Africa is the part highly heat, and this is manifested by the summer heat waves over North Africa, which actually trigger over the past decades more active African monsoon. Next slide, please. So on the glaciers, we have 3 mountains in Africa with glaciers. Mount Kenya, Rwenzori, and Kilimanjaro. And these three graphs are indicating the quick decline in the glaciers. And given these trends, we are not expecting to have any more glaciers by the 2040s. In the Mount Kenya case, it is even expected to be deglaciated before the 2040s. Next slide. So this is the message I wanted to put across on precipitation. Even though even in IPCC global assessments, you may see more precipitation expected over the Sahel of West Africa, when we look at long-term records, more than 50 years of data, we see more of a variability, multi-decadal variability. We are currently under a wet phase, and from historical record, it is not very clear that this is a trend like you will see in temperature. So the message here is that we are in a wet phase, which is there for many decades until now. Next slide, please. So on extreme temperature, this is the number of hot days over Africa since the late 70s until now, and you can see a clear trend. We move from about 2 days per year to more than 10 days per year now. So that signal is indicating that Africa is warming, also in the extremes. Next slide, please. So that's the impacts, first of all, on the disasters. And one can see that in terms of type of disasters, flood is the most frequent disaster in Africa. In terms of economic losses, it is also floods, which is bringing a lot of impacts. And then the reported death is drought. So drought is killing more than floods, but floods is having more losses than droughts. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Although we missed the presentations from Latin America and the Caribbean region, as well as the Southwest Pacific region, but they have prepared the presentations online, those slides, and we also encourage colleagues to read their presentation, their slides online, and unfortunately, at this moment, they cannot receive questions from the floor, and they cannot provide answers, but I know many of the colleagues participating here may have their questions to these different regions, but I will also try to, as the expert on the podium, if they could, they may wish to take these questions for these two different regions, because there would be some similarities due to the science for different regions, but of course the observed data will be different. But we will try to ask our colleagues on the podium to try to answer the questions to share their knowledge with you. And with that, now I will open the floor for questions and comments and also insights from you. In line with the protocol under the convention process, we will take comments from party first, and after which we will hear from observers. And for parties, you can raise your flag, and we will put you on our list. You can either walk up to these standing microphones. I think there is 1, 2, 3, 4. The nearest to you. And for those participants through the COP26 platform, please raise your virtual hands, and we will give you the floor to speak. The floor is now open. Yes, I have Nepal to be followed by India. Nepal, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the nice presentations. I would like to focus on the presentation made on Asia. So one aspect is that the presentation, I think most of the slides focused on 2020. Wondering wondering why it was limited to only 1 year. That is one question. Another is we're a little puzzled by the things presented in different slides. In one slide, it is mentioned that there's we have over around 160 million people affected and over 15,000 fatalities in the region. And it is in next slide, it is mentioned that Asia is well poised to address these issues. And it is also mentioned in the same slide that the statement is based on the data covering only around 40% of the LCDs in Asia. So using only around 40% of the LCDs, then and almost more than half of other LCDs are excluded, then how you can say that Asia is in well-poised state to make that statement? Thank you.
Thank you, Nipol, for these two questions. And I give the floor to India, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. Just to support the question by my colleague from Nepal, the slide on key messages, if that can go up again, then it will give the whole room context about what particularly stood out in the WMO Asia region presentation. And if the representative could please address this question, that how is the key message from the report saying that Asia is well placed to deal with extreme weather events? Thank you.
Thank you, India. At this moment, I didn't see any further. Oh,
Fiji.
Fiji, please. And then European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator, and good afternoon, colleagues. Despite there wasn't any presentation for the Regional Association 5 for the Southwest Pacific, I understand for this region, for the first time a report was done, and I would like to know what is WMO RCC's plan for the future for providing this type of information for this region. Furthermore, is the WMO RCC Southwest Pacific focusing their work on specific climate indicators for this region, for instance, sea level rise or tropical cyclones, because these are things of most importance for our region. And also, I would like to know if there's any information available on displacement, and probably elaborate on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiji, for the 3 questions, I think. I have European Union, please.
Thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of the EU and its member states, and we thank all the presenters for their valuable input. We understand that the benefits of the RCCs is mostly relevant for adaptation, since the information provided by them can be used to reduce risks from extreme events, for example, through early warning systems. So could you further elaborate why information on the regional level is needed in addition to global average information, and in which way does it help to understand the long-term global goal and global adaptation efforts? And another question, the information on observation is generally provided via GCOS to the convention and considered under the sub-agenda item on research and systematic observations. So how do the RCCs relate to GCOS? Thank you.
Thank you, European Union. I think before I take further requests of the floor, I can give this opportunity for experts on the podium to answer the previous questions. So I think Mr. Goto, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for good questions from colleagues from Nepal and India. So at first, actually, I'm not so sure why the year 2020 had less damages from the floods and storms related to the annual average of the last 2 decades. However, I believe that the long-term and long-lasting efforts of WMO at the regional, global, regional, and national level could contribute to reducing the damages and losses to provide the via providing early warning systems to the regions, including the developing and countries. And so I think this my comment is related to the intervention from India. So how to deal with and how to respond to the extreme event is a key area of the WMO activities. And as far as I know, WMO developed and is developing the global schemes to facilitate the issuing of early warning information for the national weather services. So I hope my interventions is enough to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goto. And I now give the floor to Stephen to address the question. You have the floor.
Yes, maybe I can elaborate a little bit on the relationship between RCC and GCOS. RCCs are serving the members of the region through the national meteorological services, and of course depend on the availability and especially accessibility of climate observations. And while GCOS is reporting about the status of the global system, the RCCs depend on the exchange of data. So there's no duplication. We just benefit from good observing systems, especially from an open and free data exchange. The other question, how regional information is relevant for the global goal on adaptation. Adaptation is more or less a local exercise, and so the region, the adaptation aspect from RCCs is also to provide a wider region, a unified and uniform information on possible future extreme events on a rather short time of weeks to maybe a season ahead. This is an extension of the normal early warning systems on the weather forecast timescale. And that's the adaptation on a different timescale, of course. And the global picture is made out of regional and local pictures, so that's the link.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure the RCCs all have the same functions. But for some WMO regions, regional statements on the climate status in the region have been developed. And like in the WMO global statement, those do also include information about displacement as long as it's relevant in the region. So I can't speak for RA5, which is the Southwest Pacific, but I would imagine if there was a regional report combined, that would include that information as well.
Thank you, Stephen. The good news, I hope the good news is Mr. Blair Tran is online, and he can give us a presentation on the Southwest Pacific region. Let's check if Mr. Tran is online. Yes.
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much. It is in your midnight. Thank you to be with us. Please, you have the floor, sir.
Okay, thank you. I believe that you are going to run my slides. Thanks. Okay, so as you have already been hearing, WMO is starting to issue regional state of the climate reports, and the first report for the Southwest Pacific region is going to be released next week, and that is for 2020, and that is hoped that these will be annual reports from then on. The Southwest Pacific region is some of the distinctive features of the region. One standout feature is that it is mostly ocean. It contains many small island states as well as larger countries such as Australia, Indonesia and the Philippines. In climatic terms, it's a region which is very strongly influenced by El Nino and La Nina, as well as the effects of longer-term climate change. The Western Pacific is one of the faster warming of the world's ocean regions. Next slide, please. Okay, so as is the case for most other parts of the world, recent years have been amongst the warmest on record for the region. Overall warming for the Southwest Pacific region is about 1 degree since the early 20th century. So not quite as fast as high northern latitudes, but similar to many other tropical regions. Sea level rise in many parts of the region, particularly the Western Pacific, is faster than the global average, reflecting the relatively fast warming rates of the Western Equatorial Pacific. That is partly a response to changes in El Nino and La Nina over the last couple of decades, which may or may not be sustained, but certainly sea level rise is a very major issue for many countries in this region, particularly small island states. Next slide, please. It's also a region which is very susceptible to natural hazards, particularly tropical cyclones. By some measures, Vanuatu is the country in the world most exposed to natural hazards, not all of which are climate related, but many of which are. The Philippines has more severe tropical cyclone landfalls than any other country in the world. And the South Pacific, although its total number of tropical cyclones has been in decline, has had an increased number of intense cyclones with 4 Category 5 systems since 2015. Cyclones are not the only natural hazard in the region. Non-cyclone flooding and landslides are also often a problem, particularly in the equatorial regions, whilst Australia has suffered badly from drought, heat waves and wildfires, and drought and wildfires are often also a problem in Indonesia and adjacent countries, especially during El Nino years. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I think that I'll just add in response to the Fiji question earlier that, yes, the report to be issued next week will contain some information on displacements as well.
Thanks, Blair. Just now you received the questions from delegates from Fiji. I'm not sure if you have.
He just answered it there.
Okay. The information is that we have the presentation from Mr. Jose Morango already online, so maybe I can give the floor to Jose, please.
We can come back to Blair if there's more questions for him. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Jose.
I don't see my presentation. I mean, can you share with the rest of people?
The slides for Jose, please. Yes, it is on the screen now.
Okay, good. Hello, everyone. This is the presentation from Latin America and Caribbean for the year 2020. I mean, if somebody asks why 2020 was because of there was a request from the WMO. And then the idea is this, I mean, trying to answer those overarching questions, the status and trends of the state of climate indicators in Latin America, associated impacts and key needs. I mean, I think Latin America and Caribbean, as many other regions, are suffering the effects of impacts of extremes in climate, like heat waves, decreasing crop yield, wildfire, coral reef depression, sea level rise, and others. So the idea of reducing the global warming below 2 degrees centigrade, according to the Paris Agreement, will be necessary to try to reduce the impacts of the warming in there, I mean, with the social and economical consequences. Next one, please. Okay, in the next presentation, we have the climate trends. On your left, we have the temperature trends for the 3 regions. And according to that, in the Caribbean was the second warmest year, and Mexico and Central America was the warmest, and in South America was the second warmest. I have to say that the consequences of that in terms of glacier mass, I mean, some of the glaciers are really melting or reducing the snow cover, and the glaciers are extremely important because they are the source of water for several cities in the Andes and in the coastal region, like Quito, Bogota, Lima, and Santiago. The rates of loss have been increasing in the last 10 years or so. And also as a consequence, we have the sea level rise. I mean, in some cities, 27% of population in the region lives in cities nearby the sea. And according to the data, in the last 20 years, the sea level rise have been increasing, particularly in the Atlantic sector. And it's not just the sea level rise, but also the intensity of subtropical storms and the waves sometimes that they are invading the cities. And in terms of precipitation, a trend we have noticed in 2020, actually starting in 2099, and now even in 2021, we have in the map, for instance, the green shows rainfall above normal, but perhaps the most important are the regions with brown, which actually means the drought in southern Amazonia, drought in Pantanal, and the current drought in the Paraná, Prata Basin in most of Southeastern South America, which is having strong impacts in economy, food security, water security, and energy security. The next one, please. Yes, just to finish the presentation, this slide shows the associated impacts. I mean, if you see, the figure shows the projected changes in yields due to climate change in corn in some of the regions in Latin America and Caribbean. We have different crops in there, from corn or maize to vegetables in there. And in all of them, there is a tendency that this production will be affected by the changes in climate. As shown in the figures down there, these are the projections from CEMIP-6 models for the 4-degree warming scenario. I mean, basically the entire Amazon region and regions like the Pantanal and Southeastern South America will increase warming above 4 degrees centigrade. And the same thing with the Amazon region in terms of precipitation, with rainfall reductions to could reach the 20%, while in Southeastern South America, the increase of rainfall is in the forms of rainfall extremes. I mean, these rainfall extremes are the ones that produce natural disasters and kill people. So in Central America, 2020 had 5 more hurricanes or tropical cyclones compared to 2005. So that was a real record. And Hurricane Eta and Iota produced a lot of losses in this region. In terms of food security, in terms of including multi-hazard early warning systems, only 2 countries has these systems of early warning systems in there. And in terms of hazards, priority areas, the main flood, as seen in the case of Africa, the main problem is flood with water, too much water. But we also have the drought situation and several others. So every country has produced this kind of map. We have sort of condensed this, and we expect to have similar exercise. And I have to say that this work resulted in the State of Climate published by WMO. And this was the first time when we have a collaboration for all meteorological services from Mexico to Chile and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose, to bring us this information from Latin American and Caribbean regions. And please stay with us, and because you may receive questions. And I now give the floor to India. Just now raised their flags. Maybe it's following up questions to Mr. Goto or additional questions. And I also see Antigua and Barbuda wish to take the floor, and also United States, Japan, and excuse me, I cannot see those very far end.
Ethiopia and Kenya.
Ethiopia and Kenya. Thank you. So India, please take the floor.
Thank you for giving me the floor again, Mr. Co-Facilitator. I have a question which has 4 parts. The presenter from Africa said that Africa is warming 4 times more than the rest of the world. Could you kindly explain the science behind that? The second one is on the forest fires. We are seeing that forests of the world have burned down, which is a very unusual phenomenon for so many fires, so many forests in so many countries to have seen the forest fires. Is it due to climate change, and how? The third question is the increase in earthquakes and lightnings. Are they attributable to climate change, and how? And finally, is there any method to distinguish between artificial weather modification and climate change? Thank you.
Thank you, India. I now give the floor to Antigua and Barbuda, please.
Thank you so much, co-facilitators. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is to the presenter from Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you so much for the important presentation. Could you highlight your key finding on the regional climate in the Caribbean region? Also, it would be helpful to receive more insights on the role of the WMO RCCs also in the future and how they tie into the global work of the WMO and the WMO's work with regards to enhancing understanding for the long-term temperature goal. And my second question, we also find the information on unprecedented climate impacts already occurring today very concerning and of key relevance to theme 1 when reflecting on dangerous anthropogenic interference of the climatic system. We also understand the unprecedented climate extremes already occurring today, and there will be an increasing occurrence of such extremes with increased warming. Could the WMO and IPCC representative comment on the emergence of unprecedented climate impacts, including also the occurrence of extreme weather events on a regional level? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antigua and Barbuda. And now give the floor to United States, please.
Thank you, and thank you to each of the presenters for the informative presentations. This is for all of the presentations. What types of regional climate information are particularly relevant and helpful for supporting actions towards achieving the long-term global goal? Can each of the WMO regional centers talk about a specific example of how they've worked to translate this climate science into climate service delivery to support these actions? Thank you.
Thank you, United States. I now give the floor to Japan, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. And also, thank you, experts, for your informative presentations. I have one question for all panelists. Yesterday, we heard about global level climate information and the importance of informing forward-looking climate information into the decision-making process. And today, WMO experts gave us useful regional climate information. How can we use different level of climate data, global and regional, to increase ambition and reduce greenhouse gas emission? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Japan. I prefer to give the floor to Ethiopia, Kenya, and Norway, and then ask the expert to answer. May I give the floor to Ethiopia, please?
Thank you. Thank you, first co-facilitator, for giving me the chance. And my question goes to the African regional representative, I mean, WMO regional representative. I really appreciate the acknowledgement of Africa's fast warming greater than global average, which actually results heat waves that we are just facing at our country. I would like to know what challenges and opportunities the African states are facing to implement their pledge, especially climate policy strategies, and what are the key needs for adapting in light of achieving the goals of the convention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethiopia. I now give the floor to Kenya, please.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator, and to all the presenters. We really appreciate the work that went into producing the reports for the regions. I have a question for the RCC, or State of the Climate, for RA1. In line with Theme 2, for a while now, lower capacity for research has been a constraint, especially in attribution of extreme events to climate change for the region. Does the report address these gaps in knowledge and possible ways to address it? And if not, how can WMO support African researchers, either through collaboration with other regional centers or capacity building to enhance the science that comes out of the region? And my second question is to all the presenters. Do these reports address interactions between multiple hazards that interact to create compound risks, such as, for example, heavy rainfall and sea level rise, or drought and land degradation? If not, we'd like to see this or commitment for this in possible future reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenya. I give the floor to Norway, please.
Thank you very much. My question is related also to compound extreme events. For instance, extreme high sea level rise, and also fire risk and so on, which also quite often consist of a combination of different factors. To what extent are these kind of compound events covered in the observations, and also to what extent are it in place early warning systems for these compound events? Thank you.
Thank you, Norway. I would like now to give the floor to our experts to share their views on the questions proposed. So first, I would like to give the floor to Andre, please. Yes, please take the floor. Yes. So should I call you Andre?
Yeah, okay. Good. I will go through some of the questions that were asked. Yeah, first, the many questions raise the issue of what is the added value of regional information. So the situation is at the global level, the systems we have to forecast and to monitor actually focus on the global events. For example, El Nino. At the regional level, you have regional drivers of what we see in the regions. And in some years, the regional drivers dominate the signal, the anomalous signal you see in a region. And most often, when you rely only on global information, you are biased and you are even wrong in the regions, in the years during which the regional drivers are playing a bigger role. Secondly, many global drivers are well observed. For example, the ENSO region, a lot of buoys to monitor sea surface temperature. But the drivers that are occurring in the regions are less observed. So you need to really focus on institutions or organizations that we set up in the regions to address those. And I indicated an example in my presentation where you will see at the on the global picture that the Sahel of Africa will have an increasing trend in precipitation. But when we in the region analyze the data, historical records for 50 years or 60 years, we see that we have a variability, multi-decadal variability, with a wet phase which can be there for 30 years or more. And so these kind of regional information can only be really well analyzed and information generated from it by regional centers. It is just because those regional centers have recently been, let's say, developed by WMO. That's why it is not yet clear on the minds of many what is the added value of regional information. Yeah, secondly, Kenya or Ethiopia responded to the question from India. What we said was that the warming rate over Africa is higher than the global average, and that the highest part of the part of Africa which have the highest warming rate is North Africa. And you all know that heat waves summer heat waves in Europe also touches North Africa. And over that part of Africa, the warming rate now is up to 4 degrees per century. 4 degrees per century. That's the trend that we see in warming over North Africa. And it is higher than what, let's say, the IPCC medium level scenarios are indicating. So for us in Africa, and that's where I will also indicate how it is used. At the African Union level, the message we take across is that concerning heat early warning systems, we have to put some effort on supporting more North Africa for summer heat waves. It doesn't mean that heat wave doesn't occur in other parts of Africa, but it looks like if we are to prioritize investment, that's where to focus. And this happened in many other products that we generate. For floods, we also have the Sahel of West Africa as a major hotspot. So if we don't have a lot of resources, we can focus our early warning system for floods over that area. We have then drought. If we don't have a lot of resources, we'll focus our investment over Southern and Eastern Africa to develop robust drought warning systems. I should emphasize that it is good, the concept of multi-hazard early warning system, but we should bear in mind the cost and the resources we have and put these regional information into play to prioritize our investment. So that's what I really wanted to share with you. Concerning GCOS and RCCs, GCOS is observations. The RCCs have a mandatory function called climate monitoring. This monitoring relies heavily on GCOS observations and GCOS guidelines to analyze the observations. So that's where the two are intrinsically linked. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. And I propose to give the floor to Jose to address the questions from Antika and Babuda, and also for those questions posed to all experts, and then to be followed by answers from experts Atsushi, and then Blair and Stephen. And please accept my apologies. I have to chair my other contact group session right now for transparency, and I will leave Tara to moderate the rest of this session. So shall we give the floor to Jose, please?
I think it is, yeah, Jose, you're welcome back. We can see you. Hold on, we can't hear you yet. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Jose, you have the floor.
Oh, Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, there have been several interesting questions. The first one, I think, was from the representative of India on fires. As you notice, in Brazil, southern part of the Amazon and some parts of the Pantanal are still on fire. Fires that started in 2019 and 2020 is still going on. These were a consequence of two things: the drought as a meteorological factor and a human increasing the greenhouse gases, but it's the lack of care from the government in terms of prevention. So it basically took by surprise because not many government actions were taken to try to reduce this risk. In terms of the Caribbean, yes, the data we get from the Caribbean allowed us to show that 2020 was the second warmest year since the early 60s. This warming was very extreme in the last 10 years or so, but we have to depend sometimes in data. And as it was mentioned, some of the data of the Caribbean is very sparse. So we need more data. It's clear that all the information we got was from the meteorological services, working together with institutions, with research centers and universities. I work, for instance, in a research center from the government with multi-hazards, which basically early warning systems. And we are doing some studies in terms of compound events, like the drought in Pantanal in 2020, and then a heat wave that affected the same region in September, which is the peak of the dry season, I would say, the peak when we have more hurricanes. So it was a compound event we need to understand, and we need to make attribution studies that has to do with climate change. And the climate services, there was a question on that. I think that the meteorological services produce this kind of climate services in terms of seasonal forecasts. And my center, it produces the early warning systems. It basically is the alerts of natural disasters from hydrometeorological origin. Okay, so my center works, we don't work with earthquakes or tsunamis or volcanoes. We work basically with too much rainfall that produces landslides or floods that kill people, and the droughts in there, which the droughts are becoming more extreme, more intense. And in the case of this Amazon region, even with other regions like the Cerrado type or Pantanal vegetation type, some of the deforestation, either legal or illegal, has been favoring the fires in there. So I think I managed to answer all questions. These are very compound questions, but I think I managed to answer all of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. Can we also give Blair an opportunity to come in online to address the questions, as several of your questions were addressed to all of the presenters. Blair, I think we can hear you.
Yes.
You're welcome back.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the questions. And looking firstly at climate services in the Southwest Pacific, one of the challenges we have here is that the region has many small island states who have limited capacity. In some of the smaller countries, the entire National Meteorological Service only has a few people working for it. But there are some very effective regional collaborations on climate services. One which I'm personally familiar with is a partnership between Australia and many of the island states in the region, and provides decision support tools, seasonal climate prediction, and also support for climate change information and adaptation. Making observations in the region is also often quite challenging, and I understand that WMO is going to be announcing an initiative later this week to support better systematic observations in many parts of the world, particularly the Southwest Pacific region. Addressing a couple of the other questions, looking at wildfires and compound extremes, certainly compound extremes are an issue in many parts of the world, including ours, and drought, heat wave and wildfires are often extremes types that go together. We certainly saw that, for example, in Australia 2019, where initially you had severe drought and that enabled the occurrence of severe wildfires and also heat waves. And there was actually quite good seasonal outlooks providing information on the higher risks of that situation ahead of time. Looking at wildfires more generally, clearly climate is only one of several factors governing wildfires. As earlier speakers have said, there are also issues around deforestation in particular. But what we do know is that in many parts of the world, especially out in the middle and higher latitudes, dangerous fire weather, and that is associated with some of the extreme fire activity we've seen in some of those regions in recent years.
Thank you, Blair. You dropped out there right at the very end, but I think we got most of your message. And thank you for addressing some of the points in the questions that were addressed to all of the regional centres. Stefan, did you want to have a chance to respond?
Yes, maybe I can touch on a few of the questions. The relationship between earthquakes and climate change, it's hard to imagine given the amount of energy that's associated with earthquakes and temperature rise. Lightning, there are the challenges that the observations of lightning has changed over the past from observer-driven observations for thunderstorms to now detecting lightning with radio technologies and also satellites. So the challenge is there to combine those two observations. From the warming temperature and increased humidity, you would expect more convective events, and that those might go with more lightning and more damages also associated with lightning. But the analysis of the data has still to be done. Turning information into action. The functions of the RCCs are defined and negotiated with the members in the region. So typically RCCs collect data and provide data sets, and they do climate monitoring and climate prediction. A few RCCs might also include projections. So of course, through this activity and providing such type of services to the members in the region, we enable, and that's the goal, we enable the members through the national Met services to serve their users at the national level without interfering with the individual national Met services tasks. On multiple hazards, WMO is developing an implementation plan for cataloging hazardous events. That is not being carried out in most of the region in a systematic way. We started some pilot projects in 2 regions, in RA6 and RA5, I think. So in the future, that might be a source of information for analyzing the damages reported and associate the damages with the meteorological and climatological conditions. And that might then lead to further research work on whether there are trends or not. I think, yes, and fires are covered in the observations, so from satellites, and in Europe there's the Joint Research Center providing such services, but there are others as well. So fire is monitored, and there are even forecast systems for fires in place. But that's not a function typically associated with an RCC, because that has not been requested or agreed with the members. That was no, at least for us, that was no issue. Thank you.
So just want to check on 2 things with you. So in terms of translating climate science into climate service delivery, that is part of the business of regional climate centres. Your data is being used to inform things like, for example, early warning systems. Is that fair to say? Just I'm picking up on the US question.
Yes, the philosophy is that RCCs should provide functions and services that enable members at the national level to fulfill their mandates with regard to climate services.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're like
and
the
also
base
giving
information.
a regional picture, because at the national level you may only look at your national conditions, but it is also relevant to see across the borders.
Yeah, that's something I'm definitely taking away from this, is that the collaboration between the national level centres is building up a stronger regional database of information. Yeah. Did you want to add anything else on the question around attribution, how the observations being collected at regional level, this was from Kenya, are they helping us with attribution?
Attribution is based on observations, yes. RCCs can contribute to improve the accessibility to observed data, but attribution is also a very computer-intensive activity, not yet being carried out routinely. I think there are plans or activities underway to move it to more routine activity, but that's yet outside of the mandate of an RCC.
Okay.
These are research groups that are still carrying that out, and Met Services as well.
Great, that's a useful clarification. Yeah, so what we'll do is I'll go to Atsushi first and then come back to you, Andre. That's okay. Atsushi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tara. So I'd like to respond some interventions from Japan. Japan focuses how to use different level of information to achieve the reduce the greenhouse gases. So needless to say, all parties share one atmosphere and one climate systems. In this regard, global scale climate information, such as greenhouse gas concentrations and global average temperature, is indispensable as a scientific basis of the global scale efforts. On the other hand, the impacts of climate change is different from one region to another. In this regard, I think our regional climate information presented today is very useful to attract the regional actors, such as regional developing organizations or regional donors in the regions. So, and I'd like to add some comments to the questions from US, how to deal with regarding the science to services in climate services. This point is quite important to
And then we have the data from some of the reinsurance companies like Munich Re. But some of these data banks, they don't talk to each other. So it's very hard to have. Even in my center, which we work with monitoring and early warning of natural disasters, we are creating also our data bank. But in each state of Brazil, because Brazil is a federation, these data banks are different. So I would say it would be great to have a unique, unified data set on natural disasters that we all can use. But the problem is still this integration is not working well. I mean, if somebody says landslide in one particular place, may have another definition in other continents. But the only common thing is the landslides perhaps is a disaster that kills more people in Brazil.
Okay, thank you, Jose. I'm going to move on and just hear quickly from Blair so that each person.
I also lead the high impact event section for the WMO's Global State of the Climate, and I also lead the observed temperature assessment for IPCC, which is relevant to some of the questions asked. So just touching quickly on some of these areas. Following on from what Jose said, information about high impact events is often quite challenging to get, particularly the impacts of those events. We have a well-established system in WMO for exchanging meteorological data, but there's no comparable system really for impacts data. MDAS is very good at what it does, but often it's hard to find the traceability of some of the information there, so that's certainly a major challenge. Ethiopia's question, as I mentioned briefly in my earlier presentation, WMO, in conjunction with, I think, UNDP, is making an announcement this week about a new systematic observations financing facility to support improved observations in least developed countries and small island states, and hopefully that will improve data availability in many regions where we struggle to get data from at the moment. And of course, if you don't have observations, you can't really do attribution studies, which is one of the reasons why regions such as Africa and South America are very underrepresented in the extreme events attribution literature. Finally, coming back to the first question in this sequence about the apparent differences between the regional and the IPCC temperature change assessments. The assessments are using the same fundamental underlying data sets, but regional statements are looking at more local detail than IPCC and also sometimes looking at different time periods. So, for example, if you look at the temperature trend maps which are presented in the IPCC report, the map of observed trends over the 1980 to 2020 period, for example, shows warming rates of greater than 0.4 of a degree per decade in particularly northeastern Africa. But the headline findings of IPCC are inevitably going to be at the global scale and looking at the longer time periods, whereas regional state of the climate reports have the ability to focus much more locally and sometimes focus on shorter periods where the data quality is better than it is further back into history.
Thank you, Blair. Sorry, we have a funny little delay going on, but thank you very much for that. Just as well for our colleagues who are watching online, the video streaming is now back working, so the issue that the colleague gratefully raised from Canada, that seems to have been resolved. Okay, so let's go and hear from you, Atsushi.
Yes, thank you, Tara. First, questions from Chile are regarding the WM's activities to cataloging the hazardous event. I think this is they're underway to develop of the development to make this cataloging system sustainable, reliable, and operational. So I think it will be in operational, but and the next question about how to harmonize the information from IPCC and RCC or WMO. I think this is a very frequently asked questions. From my point of view, IPCC's assessment report provides a comprehensive scientific basis regarding the climate change. On the other hand, information from WMO, RCC, and National Met Services is state of the latest status of climate, and frequently this is frequently updated. Otherwise, IPCC reports provided by the several years. I think this is this information is very this information compensate each other. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Atsushi. Andre, would you like to add? Yeah.
Yeah. Also, just to make sure that we understand well this issue of 4 degrees, basically we are used to plus 1.5 degree warming. That's the magnitude of the warming. Then there is a second parameter on which we should look very carefully, which is the warming rate. That is the rate of warming. As said by my colleague, he said over North Africa you have 0.4 degree per decade. That's 4 degrees per century, and when you put it in a 100 year. And at the global level also, there are estimates of the warming rate. And I'm saying again that we should focus on it because when you look at temperature trends, there is an increase in the warming rate that we are not very much focusing on it. We are just seeing the 1.5 or 2. But we should be careful on the rate on which it is actually warming. So for Africa, the highest warming rate is about 4 degrees per century or 0.4 degree per decade over North Africa. The rest of the continent is not yet warming at that very high rate. Then there was a question on what is WMO doing to support actually the improvement in the observation system over Africa. Recently, we had the Systematic Observing Financing Facility, which is spearheaded by WMO, to implement what we call the Global Basic Observing Network. So WMO have come out with a Global Basic Observing Network, which should be implemented across the world. And for developing countries, a financing facility has been set up to do 2 things. First, provide technical assistance where it is needed, and grants to set up these observing systems. Then there was, on the issue of cataloging extremes. Yes, WMO has come out with guidelines for that. As you know, we need in the countries and regions structural reforms to make sure that there is a clear working relationship between the National Meteorological Service, who monitored the weather parameters, and then the disaster management agency of the country. Actually, the impact data in some countries are available in National Statistics Institute, in National Disaster Management or Civil Protection agencies, but they are not yet structurally, operationally connected with the Met services to make the databases interoperable. So it's usually just a matter of making the two data sets interoperable. And in some cases, we'll need to build the impact data and structure it for it to work. And I think this can be a priority actually for us because it is even hampering our capacity to tailor warning or watches that we issue for our different users, in particular DRR. I think, yeah, on the, some words on the RCCs and IPCC work. I think in the IPCC assessment report, there is a regional chapter. But what I wanted just to emphasize is that we are continuing to strengthen that relationship because the RCCs have the experience and the expertise in the observations in their regions, in managing it, in looking at the trends, and the IPCC have the modeling framework, the global modeling framework, and sometimes support regional modeling frameworks. The data set or the information from these two sources should come together. And it should not be a surprise that what you see at the global level changes somewhat at the regional level because you have specific regional features, as I said, some which are not a global focus. And that explains why you can find these differences because regional phenomena are not always monitored or observed effectively like the global one. And I mentioned ENSO, El Nino region. It is well observed with a lot of buoys. But if you come in Africa, we have the African dipole mode or the Indian Ocean dipole mode, which doesn't have the same number of buoys like in the Pacific. And we have to factor this in at the regional level to generate the most robust information we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Okay, Stefan, I'm going to pass quickly over to you.
Yes, just one thing or two things to add. Yes, there will be an implementation plan ready on cataloging hazardous events, and some RCCs may play a role in collecting these events systematically. And I would also like to point out that might then, once we have that database, you might connect this with the reporting obligations under the Sendai framework on damages of extreme events. And that's an open opportunity. One point that has not been mentioned is the intervention by Canada that precipitation monitoring remains a challenge. Yes, that's true, and for many areas. However, there is a Global Precipitation Climatology Monitoring Center, just by chance operated by the Deutsche Wetterdienst in Germany. They collect, out of the estimated 200,000 in situ observation sites globally, they have at their best times about 100,000 stations. A few of them are exchanged regularly because they are operated by national Met services, but many are not regularly exchanged. But there is a huge database starting with monthly precipitation data, but they are now looking into daily data, and they will come up with daily indices and trends and so forth, and all the analytics you can do. And that is probably the best database you can have on precipitation observations.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make sure that any observers in the room knew that they did have the opportunity to ask questions as well. We have heard from the parties. Come and take the floor, please, sir, and perhaps tell us who you are. And Jianfu, can you give me that useful information that you had there a second ago? It's also just to let you know in the context of systematic observations that the Systematic Observation Financing Facility will be launched here tomorrow. And the facility aims to support LDCs and SIDS to achieve the Global Basic Observing Network, which Andre was telling us about. So if that's of interest to anybody, you can learn more about that tomorrow. So to the observer at the back, would you introduce yourself and we welcome your question. And then we're going to move on to the next panel. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Of course. Thank you. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm a senior fellow at the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, CFACT. And I just had a question about, so the warming trends you've described in the different regions, with respect to CO2 and its impact, CO2 is also, is it not, increasing wheat yields, crop yields, rice? These are skyrocketing in recent years, the yields from these and other agriculture. So is not rising CO2 greening the earth more and allowing for feeding the world's poor to a much healthier, greater degree? You know, I was wondering if you could react to that, talk to that issue. Thank you.
Does one of the panel want to take that question? Nobody leaping for it. And Andre. Yeah, please, thank you.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is rising CO2 for us in Africa is creating disruptions on the onset, on the total amount of seasonal rainfall, and on the cessation of the season. So the impact that we see on those three basic agricultural calendar parameters are difficult to imagine being conducive to better yield. But probably in other regions, and that's the case, but for Africa, it's the effect of those three anomalous behaviors that we are seeing are negative on the crop yield.
Thank you, Andre. That's very clear. Okay, thank you. I am going to thank our amazing panelists, to Blair and to Jose, who have joined us online and stuck with us with the difficulties of connection. Thank you so much. To Atsushi, Andre, and Stefan, who've joined us here in Glasgow today, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your presentations. Those presentations and all of the posters are online, so you can look at them all again in your leisure if there's more of that information that you want to take on board. For me, this has helped us definitely in terms of the theme one of the structured expert dialogue and the specific part of the mandate that asks us to look at progress made in relation to addressing information and knowledge gaps, including with regard to scenarios to achieve the long-term global goal and the range of associated impacts since the completion of our last periodic review in 2013 to 2015. So thank you, this has been very useful. What we're going to do now, if anybody needs to jump up and down to wake themselves up or do anything like that, is just have about 30 seconds while our panelists step down. And I want to invite our next panelist, please, to come and join me. We have, in our next session, we're going to be hearing from the IPCC, from the OECD, and from the Third World Network. So please do come and join us. And everybody, you can get ready. I don't know, if you need to stand up, jump around, you're more than welcome. It's a long time sitting down, 3 hours. I feel that even sitting up here, so feel free to have a stretch. On Zoom. Okay, thank you, everybody. So we're going to get started with the second half of today's proceedings. So we're going to focus this time on this theme 2 of the Structured Expert Dialogue, where we're assessing the overall aggregated effect of the steps by parties to reach the long-term global goal. So this is theme 2. And to get started, we're going to have 3 speakers who'll give us brief 3-minute presentations each. As I say, from the IPCC, where Valerie's going to present, but obviously you can see we have a wealth of IPCC authors with us, so we'll be able to draw on a big pool of expertise. Mr. Panmao Jai was hoping, again, we have been trying all day to connect him from China without success. So our greatest apologies to Panmao. We want to hear from him. He is connected to the IPCC colleagues through Slack and various other online methods, so he will be able to fit in. But it is a great shame that we don't have him here. So with Valerie, we have Richard Jones. Richard, I'm going to ask you also later in the discussion to help us with some of the questions we had in the preceding session around consistency between RCC and IPCC data. That seemed to be a recurring theme. So you're very welcome, Richard Jones. And we have Ms. Sonia Seniverante. I hope I haven't done anything too awful to your name. You're very welcome. And Alex is with us, or no? No, okay, that's fine. But thank you all for coming, and Anna is with us as well. Thank you all for coming and for helping us. And then, of course, we have Mina Raman with us from the Third World Network. Mina, you're very welcome. And Mr. Rodolfo Lacey from the OECD. We will start today with the presentation from the IPCC. Then we're going to hear from Mr. Rodolfo Lacey, who's Director of the Environment Directorate of the OECD, and he'll share with us key findings from the OECD IEA analysis on countries' net zero targets. And he has a new initiative launched today, which is relevant to our work here, which will also be mentioned. And then we look forward to hearing from Ms. Reena Raman, who will present perspectives from the Third World Network. And we'll do as the last time, we'll hear from our presenters, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion, and we'll have up until 6:30 for that discussion. Again, hearing from parties first, but observers we're also very much inviting and wanting to hear from you as well. For anyone who is online, you can please, when it comes to the time for the discussion, raise your virtual hand so that we can bring you in as best we can as well. So to get started, let's turn to you first, please, Valerie, and your IPCC colleagues. Your slides will be shown on the screen, and you can move them along yourself. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you very much. So on behalf of Panmao, I will report on regional climate change aspects from the 2021 climate report, and around a third of the report is focused on regional climate information. Human influence on the climate is now unequivocal, and climate change is already affecting every region across the globe, with human influence contributing to many observed changes in weather and climate extremes, illustrated here for hot extremes, heavy precipitation events, and drought. Climate change information is increasingly available and robust at regional scale for impact and risk assessment. In the report, we use the framework of 30 different climatic impact drivers to describe physical climate system conditions, means, events, extremes, that affect an element of society or ecosystems. And depending on system tolerance, these climatic impact drivers and their changes can be detrimental, beneficial, neutral, or a mixture of each across interacting system elements and regions. The report shows that human-induced climate change has already altered the profiles of climatic impact drivers and resulted in shifting magnitude, frequency, duration, seasonality, and spatial extent of the associated indices. With further global warming, every region is projected to increasingly experience concurrent and multiple changes that are region-specific in those climatic impact drivers. The assessment shows that changes would be more widespread at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degree global warming, and even more widespread or pronounced for higher warming levels. I use here one example, extreme heat thresholds that are relevant to agriculture and health. these thresholds are projected to be exceeded more frequently at higher global warming levels. It is illustrated here for the increase in the number of days where maximum temperature is above 30 degrees compared to the recent past for different levels of global warming. Higher latitude ecosystems will be affected by lower extreme heat thresholds as well. The report shows that strong reductions in greenhouse gas emissions would strongly limit the increase in the frequency of extreme sea level events, heavy precipitation and pluvial flooding, and exceedance of such dangerous heat thresholds, while limiting the number of regions where such exceedances occur. And it illustrates how the climate we experience in the future depends on decisions now. In our report, you will find the current state of knowledge related to best practices to distill context-specific, actionable climate information. This includes the methodological process used in the report to construct and synthesize climate information, but also the co-production that needs to take place to allow this information to inform action in an interactive process involving multiple stakeholders. To finish, I want to flag that on our report website, you will find a region-by-region synthesis in our technical summary. Using the interactive atlas, you can access data sets, as I showed before, through a wide range of variables and indices, as well as the regional synthesis, and you can generate your own visuals. We also provide a 2-page summary fact sheet for each continent and small islands, mountains, urban areas, and the ocean. The IPCC team stresses that you are welcome to join the regional events scheduled in the Science Pavilion during this week and next week. And finally, today, many decisions are taken that are only informed by knowledge of past climate, which I describe as looking in the rearview mirror backwards. And this means that we are running behind our changing climate. So using today's knowledge on what has already changed and the full spectrum of future changes is critical to better inform forward-looking risk management and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. So it'd be really great to be able to come back to you and discuss some of those points and the new concepts that you're bringing out in the discussion. But let's go ahead and hear from Mr. Rodolfo Lacey next from the OECD. Rodolfo, you have the floor. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to the OECD to this event. I think that it is important that our countries, of course, be engaged in these net zero targets, but it's also very important to track this ambition and create the necessary conditions to take good policy decisions in order to be sure that we are reaching the targets. Different parts of the world have different starting points, so we are tracking those different circumstances in economic terms. You know that the OECD is an organization to promote good policies in the economic and development domain. We are good in tracking the money. That's why we are able to provide the report about the 100 billion commitment that developed countries did in 2009 to developing countries. So we will be projecting a small video about the new platform that we just launched 2 hours ago. Is the International Program for Action on Climate, where we are merging economic data, data that the OECD is the only institution that are receiving this information about the financial flows. We are custodians of subsidies, taxes. We are tracking almost 3,600 different economic policy instruments, and we are now able to merge that information with the environmental conditions of the planet related with climate change, see what are the impacts, measure the economic elements of those impacts, and provide information in economic terms about the actions that our country members are taking. We are including in this new platform all OECD countries, 38 countries, plus G20 countries, and the key partners of the OECD. In total, 50 countries that from them, 38 now have climate neutrality goals. That is the contribution that the OECD is providing now, and this is very important. Let me give you 3 or 4 examples, because I'm seeing that the video is not running yet, but it will be in a few moments. We are tracking carbon taxes, and we develop an indicator that is effective carbon rates. Effective carbon rates try to explain how our carbon taxes, excise, carbon-related policy instruments are really part of the carbon pricing schemes or mechanisms that our countries are implementing. We think that it is not enough to have a carbon tax. There are different direct and indirect taxes that are, of course, affecting the use of, for example, fossil fuels. And in the other side of the coin, we are tracking subsidies. That's why it is important to insist in phase out all these fossil fuel subsidies. We are custodians of that information. We are tracking 760 billion US dollars of subsidies. From them, we know that almost 350, 350 subsidies can be harmful to the environment and can contribute to the climate change. So the idea is to show in these different indicators how all these elements of our financial and economic flows are, of course, helping to increase or exacerbate the climate change phenomena, or to reduce their effects, or to adapt our economies to a new normal that is affecting our common lives. So that is the meaning of this new platform. We are showing in a new dashboard a set of 10 different indicators, but this is a progressive effort, a work in progress that will incorporate almost 60 different indicators, economic indicators related with climate change that we have in the organization. The Environment Directorate that I am coordinating is part of the OECD family, as well as the International Transport Forum, the International Energy Agency, and the Nuclear Energy Agency. So we are merging a strong, robust databases of all these institutions in this new platform. This platform is created to help countries in these new strategies, long-term strategies of climate neutrality.
Thank you very much, Jose. Yeah, so I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to you around the work that you're doing in the OECD to track evidence of the steps that parties are taking to move towards the long-term global goals. So we'll be able to come back to you and hear from the questions that the parties and observers have at that stage. But let's go over now to Meena Raman from the Third World Network. Meena, you have the floor. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. We were asked to look at the assessment of the overall aggregated effect. So we definitely needed a context. And for us, the context was actually the Cancun decision, which acknowledged that the largest share of historical global emissions of GHGs originated in the developed countries, and that owing to this historical responsibility, the developed country parties must take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse impacts. And also there was a reference in the Cancun decision that there has to be a level of reducing the aggregate emissions consistent with then the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. And that was actually the level of emission reductions for Annex 1 parties by 2020 compared to 1990 levels that is referred to as the 25% to 40% reductions. And then, of course, this was also echoed in the Doha Amendment of the Kyoto Protocol, and for a revisit to happen, and so that parties, the Annex 1 parties, would be at the level consistent with the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. We also had of course, the IPCC. You've heard so much about them. That was very important for us. The physical science also has shown that the AR6 reaffirms that there is a linear relationship between the cumulative emissions and the rise in global surface temperature. I'm not going to go into all the details. You've heard that. But the issue really is that given the cumulative emissions to date, this implies that more than 80% of the carbon budget for the 1.5 degree target is already exhausted, and that the world has only 500 gigatons of CO2 of emissions left at its disposal. And we understand also from experts that the global emissions databases tell us that developed countries have been responsible for over 60% of the past emissions. So in this sense, we cannot ignore past historical and cumulative emissions and just focus on future emissions. So we can see that this is far away from the 25%. 25 to 40%. And the assessment is clear in relation to the non-EIT Annex 1 parties. This is from the UNFCCC itself. Their aggregate emissions actually increased in the pre-2020 timeframe and have not gone below 1990 levels. So the message here is that the pre-2020 emissions gap must be closed by Annex 1 parties, consistent with the Cancun and the Doha decisions, and this is a matter of ensuring trust in the multilateral process. And then finally, on the realizing the 100 billion per year goal, this is really what this whole COP is talking about. And the the biennial assessments have also revealed that in the reports that about US 45.4 billion in 2017 and 51 billion in 2018 was what came from the public financial sources. Of course, the OECD is here, but we have looked at their report, and they say that in 2018, it was 78.9 billion. We've all heard that the 100 billion per year has not been realized. But what's important also, Oxfam's Climate Finance Shadow Report 2020 on the 100 billion goal, it shows that climate-specific net assistance may just be around 19 to 22.5 billion in 2017 to 2018. So the report also states, this is Oxfam's, that 20% of the reported public finance was estimated to be grants, compared to 80% reported as loans and other non-grant instruments, and that all of the reported climate finance, about 40%, was non-concessional finance. An issue is how climate finance is counted. I think this is really recognized. But the needs expressed by the NDCs of developing countries, as we know, this is under the Paris Agreement, of course, it is $5.8 to $5.9 trillion by 2030. And UNCTAD, at the last event, I recall, Dr. Richard Kozel-Wright, who was here, he did say that about 2% of the world GDP annually is needed, which is upwards of $1.7 trillion for developing countries to achieve the Paris Agreement and Agenda 2030 in the coming decades due to the pandemic and some new resources that we have. So our assessment is that we didn't do very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mina. Thank you all colleagues and panelists for your presentations, for getting them to us in advance. Thank you, and for presenting them to us here and online. So the floor is now open for our discussion and any questions that you have. So I see that Switzerland has a question. I'll just take note of the names, and I see Antigua and Barbuda. And I see Bolivia, sir, and Saudi Arabia, and the EU, and Fiji, and India, and the US. You keep adding your names if you wish to, and Norway. The colleagues in the Secretariat will help me to make sure I haven't missed anybody. But Switzerland, sorry, you have the floor. You're very welcome, ma'am.
We would like to thank you warmly, Tara and Gao, the two co-facilitators, for all their very good work during the SED1 and this SED2 session, for the SED1 summary report as well, and we are very happy to gather physically. Given the presence of fellow scientists from the IPCC and the limited time at our disposal, we would like to focus on questions on latest science delivered. First, could you elaborate a little bit more on the impact on cryosphere of the different emission scenarios you presented yesterday on glacier, Arctic, but also Antarctic ice loss? Second, do you have new scientific evidence on tipping points and the way specific trends could be irreversible according to different temperature scenarios? And thirdly, according to you, what are the knowledge gaps on tipping points that science would have to fill in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear questions. Thank you very much to Switzerland. Antigua and Barbuda, you are next. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, co-facilitator. Just a side note, I'm used to sun, sea, and sand, and it's a bit chilly in here right now.
Oh yeah, thank you for saying we had that yesterday too. So Danny and colleagues, if you can turn down the air conditioning a bit, please. Even the Irish person is feeling a bit cold. So I can't imagine for you. So, yes.
Thank you so much. So Antigua and Barbuda speaking on behalf of AOSIS. We'd like to thank the IPCC co-chair for the informative presentation that was presented today. Also like to thank all of the IPCC authors for all of the intensive extensive information rather on climate change at the regional level. So the Interactive Atlas is very comprehensive, and it highlights the work that was put in by you guys. So many appreciation for this. So many regions do not necessarily have access to high quality information on observed and projected climate change at regional levels. So again, thanks for that. We do regard the scientific information both at the global and at the regional level as the foremost and most reliable source of information on these issues. So my first question is to the IPCC. Could the experts that are present today, could you elaborate on what regional information specifically for small island developing states, or SIDS, is available in the report and in the Interactive Atlas? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Antigua and Barbuda. Bolivia, so you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and all of the scientists. Well, when we talk about climate justice and we talk about getting out of the climate change crisis with equitable solutions, yesterday we heard with a lot of interest and paid attention to the new information and scientific presentation that you prepared for us and this conference. Thank you very much for that. Even further, you provided answers to questions about potentially solutions for the terrible scenarios that humanity is facing in this climate crisis. We are very thankful for this opportunity to learn from experts and to share with you our worries. I would like to make a question to go deep dive on solutions. For developing countries, the solution to this crisis must be in a manner which helps us and the world to solve what is perhaps the most important problem of all times, poverty. And at the same time, promote equitable and just new world. A more equitable world is, as social scientists already know, the best tool to prevent conflicts and the basis of a new society building harmony with nature and social inclusiveness. On the other hand, political solutions built with agreements between parties must be based on best science possible at these times. That's why we say thanks to these contributions. So, taking into account all of this and all of the complexities involved, questions are, it is possible that you, and as climate scientists and experts, can propose to us and to the planet a solution or solutions or points of view to the climate crisis that can, at the same time, drive to an equitable world free of poverty and conflicts. It is possible that you include in your equations the historical emissions that represent the unjust side of the climate crisis. It is possible for the scientists to include in their studies and conclusions these other dimensions. The main dimension that I'm talking is the climate crisis justice dimension. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take maybe one more, and then we'll get some answers so that we get to come back and forth between each other. So Saudi Arabia, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. I would like, I'm speaking on behalf of the Arab Group, and would like to thank all the presenters for the informative presentations. I have two questions, one for the IPCC and the other one for OECD. For the IPCC presentation, on the first slide, we are a bit surprised to see that the limited data and low confidence in a majority of regions. Yet the conclusion was drawn in IPCC report, the physical science one, the first part, based on this low level of confidence, especially on the agriculture and precipitation areas. So how would you justify and react to this one? My question to OECD, you mentioned in the on the contribution to SED2 that the OECD's International Program for Action on Climate provides for clear, comparable indicators on national and collective efforts toward net zero. My question is, how are the impacts of response measures and economic diversification would be addressed in such program? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay. So we might start with Valerie and the IPCC colleagues. So a question there from our colleague from Saudi Arabia, questions from Bolivia around issues of how issues of justice and equity are addressed in the science, from Antigua and Barbuda around specific information on small island states and on the cryosphere scenarios and tipping points and knowledge gaps from Switzerland. So lots of questions there to you all. I'm sure, as you did yesterday, you will share them out and get us a whole set of excellent answers. Thank you.
Thank you. So regarding the cryosphere, you can see a summary at the end of our chapter 9 on the ocean, cryosphere and sea level. And there are aspects that react directly to the level of warming, Arctic sea ice, for instance, or snow retreat or permafrost thaw, and aspects that have a longer response time. So for warming levels between 1.5 and 2 degrees, the Arctic would become practically sea ice free in some years. Ice sheets would continue to lose mass, and there's medium confidence and limited evidence that the ice sheet would not be lost entirely over multiple millennia. Regarding glaciers outside the polar ice sheets, about 50 to 60% of current glaciers would remain on the long term. The spring snow cover would decrease by around 20% compared to the recent past, and there would be about 50% of loss of the permafrost surface volume. That's an order of magnitude. And for warming levels between 2 and 3 degrees on the long term, the Arctic Ocean would be practically sea ice free through September in many years. There's limited evidence for irreversible loss of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets on multiple millennia, but the probability for increased rate of mass loss increases with higher temperatures, and about 50 to 60% on the long term of glaciers would be lost. And there would be a larger retreat of spring snow cover. 3/4 of permafrost would be lost for surface permafrost in the Arctic for long-term responses to 2 to 3 degrees of warming. And for sustained warming between 3 and 5 degrees, the Arctic would be practically sea ice free several months in most years. And then there is medium confidence for near complete loss of the ice sheets irreversibly over multiple millennia, and 60 to 75% of current glaciers to disappear. So it gives you an idea of what could be the, by the end of the century, responses, and then the long-term effects on glaciers and the very long-term effects on ice sheets. Regarding aspects for tipping points in this report, we explore them in different ways. So we explore the potential of abrupt change, the possibility of irreversible behavior. We compare our assessment to the previous ones, and we assess the projected changes on the continued warming this century. So, for instance, there is a conclusion that Arctic summer sea ice changes are not reversible. In our report, we see no specific tipping point for that. We have a very low confidence for aspects related to irreversibility for the Antarctic sea ice. However, there is potential irreversibility, as I have stressed, for the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. It's also the case for changes in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So for this century, for instance, for the Atlantic circulation, we have a very likely decline this century, medium confidence of no collapse this century. And then we provide a storyline of if a collapse happens, then this is the knowledge that we have on the multiple consequences, including for changes in tropical rain belts. So this gives you a sort of overview of how we approach these possible tipping points. We also approach them through the angle of biogeochemical tipping points that can affect the ability of, for instance, vegetation to store carbon. So we assess the possible feedbacks associated with tropical forest dieback or boreal forest dieback, and provide the estimated corresponding amount of maximum CO2 release. I think I will stop that, and I think I've addressed some of the questions on the cryosphere and the tipping points. And regarding gaps, the report clearly flags deep uncertainty associated with Antarctic sea ice and the Antarctic ice sheet response, for example. I would like now maybe to invite Richard and Sonia to address the questions regarding specifically, I think, small islands, and also the questions regarding precipitation and drought.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to the delegate from Antigua and Barbuda, especially for the kind words on the interactive atlas. And just to say that if you would like some more information on this, which was a part of your question, there is going to be one of the IPCC regional events which is happening, focusing on the small islands, which will be next Monday, and that will include an overview of the information we have in the report, plus a demonstration of the interactive atlas, so you could see more information. But just to go back to the question that you asked about the information that is available, we have within the atlas chapter itself, we have a cross-chapter box which focuses on the small island regions and focusing specifically on elements of changes in the climate system that might affect water resources. So we do an assessment there of changes in rainfall across the regions, changes in drought, changes in sea level rise. There is also information in Chapter 11 on the tropical cyclones, and there's a there is information in Chapter 8 on changes in the water cycle, and of course in Chapter 2 on changes in observations which relate to these regions. In the Interactive Atlas itself, we have the ability to generate regional information on quite a wide range of small island regions in the Pacific. So we have 7 sub-regions where you can generate regional information, but also the Western North Indian Ocean and the Caribbean region. And finally, as one of the outreach products that we have generated, there is a fact sheet which is available specifically on the small islands regions.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for the question. I will answer the question on the observed trend in extremes. So the slide 2 is showing with color shading the confidence in observed trends. So the level of confidence is actually, that is indicated with the dots is actually for the attribution, but any color shading would indicate at least medium confidence that there is an observed trend, either in the temperature extremes, in heavy precipitation or droughts. So basically, for all of those hexagons which are representing AR6 regions, if you have color shading, the observed trend, the confidence that there is an observed trend, either showing an increase or a decrease, is at least medium. In many cases, it's high confidence. Now, the dots are showing the confidence in the attribution on the regional scale, so whether we can attribute the observed trend to human emissions, and this is more challenging on regional scale because you tend to have more noise. So that's why on regional scale, even though you may have, for instance, medium or high confidence in an observed change, you may not always have basically medium or high confidence in the attribution. Nonetheless, aggregated on the land areas, we have, for instance, for heavy precipitation, we have high confidence that human emissions have led to an increase in heavy precipitation in most regions with sufficient observation. And for droughts, those agricultural and ecological droughts, so this refers to availability of moisture in the soils, which is affecting agriculture and ecosystems. We have medium confidence that human emissions have led to an increase of those types of droughts in some regions due to increased evapotranspiration. Thank you.
Thank you. Did we adequately answer the question around what knowledge gaps science needs to fill? Is there anything else you want to say about that, and anything in response to Bolivia's question around how issues of poverty, injustice, equity are reflected within the work of the IPCC and within science?
So I can just flag that in the report we focus on the physical science basis. So regarding the question of the role of past emissions and future emissions, it is clearly reported in that way in our summary for policymakers. So you can see the drivers of changes to date, and then how future emissions will affect future changes in addition to the past ones. The report also flags, typically related to the map we just showed before on changes in extremes, the fact that in some regions our knowledge is limited by the lack of available long-term records at sufficient resolution to be able to perform robust statistical analysis of trends, and also for some regions due to the lack of attribution studies. So this is reflected in our report and flagged specifically as it of course limits the depth of the assessment in the literature, which is then reflected in our report. I would like to know if my colleagues would like to add on that.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit, so just referring back to the one of the slides that Valerie showed earlier, in the integrating multiple lines of evidence in order to generate regional climate information, a very, very important one in that is observations, both to look at the observed trends, but also in reference to one of the questions that came up earlier in the WMO session, to be able to attribute changes. where you're combining observations with models. So the lack of a really good observational basis, it really does hinder our ability to make very clear statements about regional climate information, about what's happening now and what is going to be happening in the future. And also back to the question from the delegate from Antigua and Barbuda, this is a particular issue which we highlighted in reference to small island states, as well as the lack of information at high resolution, which is relevant to these regions.
Yeah, so on the question of the evidence that we have used and the reliability of the assessment, so for the maps of observed change in extremes, we always use multiple lines of evidence. So if there were not multiple lines of evidence, we would not have at least medium confidence. So for instance, for droughts, we also use different indicators as a source for our assessment. So we had really robust evidence whenever there is a conclusion of medium confidence. And as Valérie has mentioned also about the discrepancy between observed trend and attribution, in some cases also a lack of studies basically looking at the attribution specifically.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Yeah, so if we had more data, more observations, we would have a better understanding of the long-term global goal, is my short summary. Yeah, okay, so there was a directly to the OECD. Would you want to take that one?
Thank you very much, Saudi Arabia, for that question. I have to explain that this platform is organized according with the methodology that the OECD address all environmental problems. We measure the pressure, we measure the state, and we measure the response. In climate terms, we are trying to answer the following questions. How far are countries from achieving national and global climate objectives? So we are, of course, showing greenhouse gas emission structures and intensities. How vulnerable are countries to climate impacts and risk? We are measuring, of course, climate-related vulnerabilities and impacts on well-being. That is related with the question raised from Bolivia. And how advanced is country climate action in response to the net zero challenge? That is the core of the platform. So we are adding, of course, as I was explaining, climate-related pricing and taxation indicators, or climate-related innovation, because we are expecting more innovation from our countries, policy actions, and other policy responses on socioeconomic opportunities, because this is about the jobs, wealth, just transitions. The platform will help on that. But also, this is just a component of the dashboard of this new platform. We have 4 different components. Today, we also present a climate action monitor. Every year, we will be producing a summary of the most advanced policy action of these countries that are participating. By the way, we are inviting Saudi Arabia to join to this platform. Country notes that will go, you can see right now in the website some of the basic and more robust policy actions from regulation to the deployment massive technologies that will, of course, help us in these new trajectories, and dialogues and mutual learning elements in the platform. From my side is all that we can.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have now on our list the European Union, Fiji, India, United States, Norway, and Brazil. If anybody wants to be added to that, Canada, we have you now too. And observers as well. If after the parties you have a question, you are of course welcome. So European Union, please, you're very welcome.
Thank you. So my first question goes to the IPCC, and it's what is the relation of the regional information you have just presented from the AR6 and the Atlas, and the information which we have learned about this morning, earlier in the day, from the RCCs? And also, do you also provide observed warming trends, including for Africa? And the second question goes to OECD. How does the information provided by OECD can contribute to the mandate of the periodic review and the structured expert dialogue, which is to assess the aggregated effect of steps taken by parties, because your analysis does not seem to be global. So, but would be interesting to know. And to TWN and possibly the IPCC, the scope of theme 2 of the periodic review is to assess the aggregated steps effect of steps taken by parties to achieve the long-term global goal. And so for us, it's very important that the SED is a technical dialogue focusing on questions of technical nature. And we would therefore like to better understand the science behind the messages of your presentation regarding of this assessment, in particular on mitigation. And for example, what is the influence in scientific terms of past emissions on future warming? And I think Valerie has already alluded to it. Otherwise, I would have asked the questions, but maybe if needed, you can maybe say it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, European Union. Next, the colleague from Fiji. Over there. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator, and I join the colleagues in thanking the presenters. My question is directed again to IPCC. So it is clear in the report and as well as in your presentation that there are very different climate impacts associated with different warming levels, in particular for 1.5, 2, and 4 degrees Celsius. The extremely useful interactive atlas also utilizes these very helpful global warming levels to illustrate regional changes. It is our understanding that every fraction of warming matters for climate change. So I would like to know, could the authors please clarify what evidences there is at the global and especially at the regional level on climate impacts for the small increments of global warming? And secondly, what does the interactive atlas offer in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiji, for your questions. India, please, the delegate from India, you have the floor. I see that flag waving down the back. Panama, is it? Got you.
This is, before I ask my question, India would like to emphasize that the structured expert dialogue is not a technical exercise in results from climate science. And when you say the overall aggregated effect of steps taken by parties, that includes all the responsibilities and commitments that are under the convention. And the ultimate goals and objectives of the convention are not simply what is the temperature, but the means to achieve it, of which all of these are important, and to which I believe the Third World Network has rightfully drawn attention. We would also emphasize that the OECD in its presentation dwelt precisely on those aspects, so we would firmly request you to ensure that this is not a technical exercise to review the results of the IPCC's Working Group 1. To the specific question, the overall aggregated effect must certainly include the impact of cumulative emissions. So I would like to ask a question to which, Madam Co-Facilitators, we would like to hear both the response of the OECD and the Third World Network. Part one of the question is, what are the total cumulative emissions of all OECD parties to carbon dioxide and to non-carbon dioxide contributors to radiative forcing? What are the cumulative emissions? What proportion does it represent of historical cumulative emissions? The second part of the question is, what are the cumulative emissions associated with the NDCs and net zero commitments made by all OECD parties taken as an aggregate. The third part of the question is that it has already been noted that the figure that the latest OECD report provided on climate finance, saying that it is $79 billion, 79.8 or whatever, that number is completely out of alignment with what the SCF, Standing Committee on Finance of the UNFCCC, has produced as a number. Notwithstanding that, would it be not appropriate that given the scale of cumulative emissions that the OECD parties have already contributed and the scale of cumulative emissions that they seek to further contribute to in the coming days, should it not be that the finance that is provided by OECD parties is linked through a cost of carbon per ton, and that determines the total amount of finance. You would have noted, I am sure, that the Prime Minister of India, in his address yesterday at the high-level summit, mentioned a figure of 1 trillion. And however, if you assign even a modest amount, say between $30 and $70 per ton as cost of carbon, the excessive cumulative emissions, excessive, however it is, we may choose to find a way to define it, that would give us a figure which would run into trillions. One very last point I want to address particularly to the OECD. There has been a long-standing issue which developing country parties have raised, that the climate finance should be new and additional over development assistance. On the other hand, this has been the subject of much discussion, and the definition of climate finance, as the Third World Network has pointed out, is contested. However, the OECD recommendation, especially in its database, to take all financial assistance, whether ODA or otherwise, and asking them to assign weights according to the different aspects of the SDG goals that they relate to, and therefore leaving it to the developed countries to just define more or less as they wish, as they perceive, what is the finance that they are providing. Does not this actually undermine the discussions where we are trying to bridge the gap, which is taking place here at the COP? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your questions. I'm sure we've noted them all down carefully. United States, ma'am, you have the floor. Thank you. And Norway, I'll come to you next because I think we have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to take all of your questions so that we can have a good opportunity for the experts to respond. United States.
Great, thank you for that, and thank you to this panel also for your helpful contributions. I'll direct this question to the IPCC and to the Third World Network. As noted by the IPCC, total warming is driven by past and future emissions. We have not reached the temperature rise of the long-term global goal, and there is still time to avoid it. The warming from this point will be determined by future emissions. To succeed in achieving the long-term global goal, we have two questions. What emissions reductions from now are required? And the IPCC noted gaps in observing data as a limitation, but based on the information we do have, what approaches and strategies could we use to get on a pathway consistent with the long-term global goal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Norway, sir. Thank you. You're already there.
Thank you very much, and thank you to IPCC for a very good report. I think our review are to be based on the best available science, and this is a very good example. We also thank for the atlas that was included in the report. My question is to IPCC about what you said on the extreme sea level rise events, and that this could be reduced if the emissions are reduced. I didn't really catch what you said, and maybe also if you could elaborate a little bit on the time frame and the response time for this kind of finding, and also regional aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norway. Brazil, the delegate from Brazil, you have the floor. And then I'll come to Canada and Panama, and there's a question online as well from St. Kitts and Nevis. You have the floor. Thank you, Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator. And Brazil would like to thank very much the IPCC for indicating parts of the Working Group 1, IPCC AR6, on past and future trends. And we would also like to thank the TWN for bringing the issue on linkage between historical contributions for the global surface temperature increase and the long-term global goal. In our view, science behind the long-term global goal, in the absence of science behind the historical contributions for the global surface temperature increase, is not the best available science. And we just like to remind that when we are talking about finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, we are talking about science as well. Saying that in this context, I would like to thank the TWN for bringing the issue on the gap on finance in order to achieve the long-term global goal. And we would appreciate if the TWN could elaborate a little bit more on other aspects of the implementation of the convention, in particular technology transfer and capacity building. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Brazil. Canada, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. So the scope of this question is perhaps more global in nature, but given this is our last chance to engage with experts during this edition of the SED, we feel it's important to bring it forward nonetheless. So in particular, we're interested in understanding more about when we will be able to detect a slowdown in the rate of global warming as evidence that we are on track to limiting global warming to within the long-term temperature goal. In the Working Group 1 report, as we understand it, detecting the benefits of strong mitigation should be apparent in about 20 years. Does this take into account the potential near-term warming from efforts to curb aerosol pollution? While such action on aerosols is indeed needed to improve air quality, we think it's important to have a realistic expectation about when we will be able to detect the benefits of mitigating GHGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canada. Next, we have Panama, please. You're very well. Yeah, the floor is yours, Panama. Thank you, ma'am.
Facilitator. Panama speaks on behalf of ILEC. First of all, ILEC would like to express its appreciation for the regional focus of today's structured expert dialogue and to thank the speakers for their presentations. As each party strives to develop a clear pathway to ensure we achieve net zero emissions by 2050, we will ask the following question, both for the IPCC and the OECD. How can we best make use of the latest regional scientific information to fit into our NDCs and long-term strategies? What tools, techniques, spaces, or institutions can enable us to do so? What barriers do you believe might stop developing countries from making the most of this information, and what would you recommend to overcome them? Concrete ideas will be much appreciated, such as specific research initiatives, specific activities to strengthen scientific and technical capabilities at the national level, specific outreach and communication activities, and funding and other types of support which could be useful to roll out the above at a scale that will help us face the climate challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very specific question. I'm going to see if we can succeed in having a question from St. Kitts and Nevis from the online participants. Yeah. You're very welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Ah, yes, great to see you.
Hi. Yes, thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator, and thanks for the opportunity to participate virtually. We understand that we'll be able to ask questions as it relates to the UNEP emissions gap experts today. First of all, we'd like to express our sincere thanks to all of the presenters. We are, however, concerned to learn about the numbers of global pandemic recovery spending going into carbon-intensive measures. We are wondering how these numbers compare to the much-needed financial support for developing countries. We would like to ask the experts if they could provide more information on how these numbers compared to the much-needed financial support to allow for a green recovery from the global COVID pandemic in developing countries. We'd also like to learn more about the concrete ways wealthier economies could support vulnerable nations. Thank you, and thank you again for participating virtually.
Thank you, Sankitsa Nevis. It was yesterday that we had a colleague from UNEP here presenting the emissions gap report. If there's someone in the audience from UNEP that can speak to that, we will ask them. If not, I will make sure that we get you a written response to your question. We can do that. I know that we discussed this yesterday, this issue of the low percentage, 17 to 19% of the global pandemic recovery finance, which was being spent to reduce emissions. So if we don't get to that, we will try and do so as a follow-up to today's meeting. Are there any observers with any questions before we then go to our panelists for some answers to your questions? Yeah, you're very welcome. And please tell us who you are and where you're from before you ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator, and thank you for this very inspiring session. My name is Niklas Wagner. I'm from the University of Bonn, and I actually spoke to you yesterday evening.
You did?
To take this opportunity to ask the audience here for the PhD research I'm doing together with my colleague Sarah Lender here on the impact of science policy interfaces on policy, especially here at the IPCC on this COP. And we are conducting semi-structured interviews of like half an hour, and we would be very happy if negotiators or IPCC members would be available during the next 10 days for half an hour for an interview. So Sarah and me, we are going to be standing at the exits with a one-pager with our contact details, and would be very happy to hear back from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for making that offer. Yes, this will further increase the scientific evidence for the value of the type of exercise that we're engaged in today. So thank you for making that kind offer, and colleagues who are interested can look for you. Okay, many questions. I trust the panelists have been taking note of those that are addressed to them. So we'll just go in this order. So Rodolfo, would you like to take the floor? There were several questions for you.
Yes, thank you. I will address first the suggestions, the comments, the questions that India raised. I think that if you compare the first climate finance report that we presented in 2014, before the COP21, and the latest report that we presented, the granularity of the information increased amazingly. Why? Because countries are providing more information, more accurate information, more updated information, and we now are able to present the information according with the needs that we are discussing here from the countries. For example, we are in the latest report putting some numbers on mitigation, adaptation, mix projects, but also how much money is going to less developing countries, island countries, what are the topics that the projects on climate finance are addressing or solving or trying to solve. So this is something that is progressively helping our analysis, and if countries provide us more granularity, we'll be able, of course, to share with all the planet, the information that we have. Let me put it that way. So the thing that you are suggesting, that why don't we put historic information? Well, because countries are not providing that. Scientists are doing that effort to reconstructing the information. But we can ask, of course, and regarding why we don't disaggregate the financial flows in different SDGs, perhaps different indicators that we have for SDGs. Well, that's another step that we can take in future reports. But we are increasing, of course, our activities in coordination with donor countries or in general with the countries that are providing the information. In this regard, we can answer the question from the European Union because this IPAC platform is open to all countries. It's not only for OECD or G20 countries. All countries that can provide the information to populate, of course, the indicators and increase the granularity of the information that you now can see in the website are very welcome, and they can also, of course, contribute with their technical expertise. We have a technical expert group. We can also accept specific contributions to develop specific indicators or increase, for example, the use of tools that we can add to the platform. For example, big data coming from satellites or big data coming from Google. And now we are producing economic surveys with information that we can classify it as big data. Is information that later the countries will be validated, and that is the main meaning of all this effort that we are providing. We are very proud to contribute to this UNFCCC process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mina, there were several questions to you.
Thank you. I don't think I can answer all of them within the time frame. And a lot of it was related to what the IPCC findings are. So I'll make my task a little easy and pass a lot of that responsibility to the IPCC. But the question from the United States about the historical emissions and the future emissions, the past emissions and the future emissions. Of course, we all accept the fact that there is a need to acknowledge that, which many of you have said, and therefore, how therefore does the pathway go towards everybody is talking now about the 1.5 degree limit, but of course the Paris Agreement gives you a range. But I think by all accounts, it's very clear that the scale of the transformation that's needed is phenomenal. I think all of us have seen that. Everything shows you that. So even if you look at the previous IPCC assessment reports, because we only talked about the physical science, we are waiting for the mitigation pathway and so on, and we understand that also from the working group 2 on the adaptation, you will see much more challenges. I think what we are seeing what is clear is that the scale, not just about the temperature goal, but also in terms of the response to adaptation and loss and damage because of the inadequate efforts that has been taken to address the emission reductions. So mitigation has an effect on the adaptation and on the loss and damage. So the scale of the challenge is phenomenal. I think that's undisputable. So the point here is that what pathways do you go? So if you look at previous IPCC reports, it's really showing you that a lot of the pathways actually assume technology transfer, which is actually easy. Assume financial resources. Assume capacity building. And I think that's where we are struggling, because I think the scale of the challenge is quite clear, the needs are quite clear, and the issue really is how do we make that all happen? And I don't want to go, somebody will accuse me of getting political, but there is a very thin line between what's politics and what's science. The science tells you something, but at the end of the day, it's politics that determines how you get that pathway. So I think that's critical. But the other point I'd like to make is that this coming from our own analysis and our discussions with scientists, this net zero goal by 2050. Now, if the existing carbon budget is 500 gigatons, and if we are told that with current emissions that will be exhausted within a decade, how do you align, and probably this is my question to the IPCC, how can net zero 2050 targets square with, particularly from the developed world, because of the overconsumption of the carbon budget due to the past emissions and the cumulative emissions? How do you square that with the 500 gigaton left? There will be, if we come out of, well, this is getting to politics, but never mind. If we come out of this COP and we say that so many parties have signed the net zero pledge and 2050 and we're on the way, I don't think the budget is left for that. It's too fast, too late. We're doing too little too late. So that is one comment. So on the Brazil question, I totally agree with you. We are clear on the finance side, but it's not so clear on the technology assessment side. There's an ongoing periodic assessment of the technology mechanism. I don't know whether the SED has talked previously.
Yeah, we did in the previous session.
Yeah. So that's very critical. And also capacity building.
Yeah, we heard from the Paris Committee on Capacity Building.
So we need to take all that information to show that there's still a lot of gaps. And so if we want to achieve the Paris goals, then we really do need to plug all these gaps as soon as possible. I know I have not done justice to your questions, but we can take this outside as well.
Thank you. And you passed one of your questions on to the IPCC, so that's an even longer list for Valerie and her colleagues to respond to. Colleagues, the floor is yours to do your best to answer that long list. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much. And because of the short time, I'm going to try and answer 3 questions myself and then hand over to my colleague. So on the question from the EU about the relationship with the information we have in AR6 and that generated by the regional climate centres, I'm sure that the information is being derived from the same underlying sources. It has to be said that we haven't been able to have the time to do a sort of a really full consistency check between those two sets of information. And I know that the regional States of the Climate Report is a new initiative, and one of the notes I have taken away from this session is to make sure that in future that we really do have a good coordination between those activities. On the issue of regional warming trends for Africa, yes, we do have that information in the Atlas chapter and in the Interactive Atlas, and our sort of headline statement is that most regions over the past 4 decades are warming between 0.2 and 0.3 degrees per decade. But in some specific smaller regions, there are higher warming rates than that. All that information is there in the chapter, but also in the Interactive Atlas. So on the question that came from Fiji on the information available in the Interactive Atlas on increments of warming, we do have a function in the regional information segment of the Interactive Atlas which allows you to look at the changes in some of the climatic impact drivers across a range of global warming levels, and this is graphical information. So you are able to look between, say, 1.5 and 2 degrees, what would be the regional change in, for example, the sea level or above an extreme heat index. So that information is available in the Interactive Atlas. And just referring back to the question from Panama on the barriers to implementing action, I think that certainly the issues we have with data, which we have described before, in terms of being able to implement actions around adaptation, is actually a key a key problem. In terms of research activities, I know that there are multiple activities. For example, the UK government has got a significant program where we are working with partners in other parts of the world. So we're doing this in Southeast Asia, in China, in Brazil, in Southern Africa, where we are working alongside research agencies in those countries to address some of this climate information into climate services that would really would provide information for action. So there are activities out there which are doing that. And just related to the question from the US on the data gaps and emissions, the data gaps we were talking about were more around the observations which then allow you to understand local to regional trends and think about attribution and adaptation. In terms of the emissions, the coverage, especially from satellites now, as well as all of the ground-based and air-based observations, is much, much better. So we have a really good picture in terms of emissions.
Yeah, so I'll answer very quickly also the question from Fiji about every increment of global warming and how this is related to changes on regional scale, especially for extremes. In the summary for policymaker of the AR6 report, the word increment is used to refer to even smaller increment than 0.5. So this is indicated, for instance, used in the statement B2.2, figure SPM 5 and figure SPM 6. So it says for every increment, which means that it's not specific only to 0.5. Now about the evidence for small increments, the first evidence is the fact that we have ample evidence in the literature that there are linear relationships between regional changes in extremes and global warming. So this means that you don't even need to redefine the increment because there is this linear relationship. One example is in figure 11.3 in chapter 11. And also about the possible emergence for small increments, you could look at figure 11.8, which shows, for instance, emergence of at regional scale for temperature extremes, even for increments of 0.1 degree.
Okay, so I'm going to address several questions as well. To the question from Norway. So the report shows that when sea level is rising, extreme sea level events that occurred in the past, once a century, when you have a high tide and a storm surge, in addition to the past sea level, just because of the gradual rise in sea level, assuming everything else constant, these past centennial extreme sea level events will be more and more frequent when sea level is rising. For instance, at the global scale, by 2050, they would be 20 to 30 times more frequent. By 2100, the increase in the frequency would be more limited for low levels of warming, because then the rate of sea level rise is smaller compared to higher levels of warming, because in that case, the amount and rate of sea level rise is higher. And in the lowest scenario assessed for that, the frequency increase is 160, and in the very high emission scenario considered, it's 530 times more frequent. So what I said was, reducing emissions limits the increase in the frequency of extreme sea level events by 2100, and it also applies for longer time horizons. There was a question about what happens if CO2 emissions are to zero. So in the report, we used climate simulations where, after a gradual increase, sea level CO2 emissions are put to zero. So these are idealized simulations. In that case, what happens is the outcome of the role of carbon sinks that take up CO2 from the atmosphere and how much heat goes in the ocean. Over a period of about 50 years, the mean value of these model results is close to zero, and the likely response is less than 0.3 degrees Celsius. So that's the type of information that is included in the calculation of remaining carbon budgets, accounting for today an estimated mean value of zero response of future warming to past CO2 emissions only. But the comment was right that there are other components that can affect the radiative forcing from non-CO2 emissions. In the report, what we stress is that we have already lost part of the cooling effect of aerosols. So the corresponding radiative forcing has peaked and declined. It's a cooling effect with contrasted regional characteristics. So if we think of temperature trends in the next decades, they will also depend on emissions of short-lived climate forces and their net radiative effect, in addition to the cumulative effect of CO2. And that's a reason why we flag in the report, considering both air quality challenges and reducing the rate of warming, the importance of reducing methane emissions, because in that case, it can offset the fact of losing the cooling effect of pollution particles and maximize the air quality benefits through the role of methane for surface ozone. And then there was a question about what the report stresses about limiting warming. So the report just reports for different levels of warming, for different probabilities of obtaining that, the associated remaining carbon budgets, taking into account estimates for the non-CO2 effects. The reason why the timing for net zero is by 2050 is that this relies on scenarios with rapid decreases in CO2 emissions year after year.
But that's global, right?
At the global scale.
Right.
So as a result, you cannot directly relate today's emissions to the remaining carbon budget. You have to account in these scenarios for the decline year after year. In the report, we only used 5 illustrative scenarios, but the same assessment of the climate response from our working group report will be used in the working group 3 report for, I don't know if it's hundreds or thousands of different trajectories that take into account, of course, socioeconomic dimensions. And therefore, the working group 3 report will go much deeper into the various dimensions that have been stressed here.
Thank you very much, Valerie and colleagues, and to all of you who are still with us here in the Structured Expert Dialogue. We have gone over time. I'm sure you all need to either go home and have a rest or get to another meeting. So we're going to wrap up, but not before I express the thanks of myself and Professor Gao, who unfortunately had to run off and be chairing the transparency discussions. But I want to thank all the presenters and you, the participants that are with us here and those that have joined us virtually, for ensuring that we have had a very robust and rich exchange of views. Over the past 2 days, we have heard from a range of experts on issues related to the 2 themes under this second periodic review, both from a global and today from a regional perspective. I believe that these will contribute towards enhancing our understanding of what it will take to achieve the long-term global goal and what progress we're making towards that so far. We have gained knowledge on the global and regional trends in greenhouse gas emissions, changes in the climate system, and the associated socioeconomic impacts, different scenarios towards achieving the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius global warming goal, and our collective progress to date towards achieving them. We've also had substantial discussions on the current financial flows towards achieving the long-term global goal. With the IPCC Working Group 2 and 3 contributions that we were just talking about to the 6th assessment report due to be finished or published in February and March next year respectively, we will consider the findings from these reports on the impacts and vulnerability as well as the mitigation of climate change in our 3rd and last meeting of the Structured Expert Dialogue during the first sessional period in 2022. My co-facilitator, Professor Gao, and I will now work on preparing a summary report of this 2nd meeting, so what happened yesterday afternoon and this afternoon, as part of the 2nd periodic review. The report of the first session is already online for any of you that haven't seen it so far, and that it will be joined by the report of the 2nd part of the Structured Expert Dialogue when we have completed it. In closing, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the trust that you, the parties, have put in us, GAO and I, in facilitating this very important process. And I want to thank my colleagues in the Secretariat for wonderful support and great good humour and very hard work to support this process, both when it was virtual and now when it is happily face-to-face with you all. So thank you all very much for your participation, and we will see you at the third meeting next year. Thank you very much.